Oh, okay, wonderful. So without further ado, welcome everyone to our very first seminar in Connecting Three Worlds. For those that may not be familiarized, Connecting Three Worlds is a Wellcome Trust-funded project working on a new history of global health, for the first time incorporating the socialist world during the Cold War and after. We focus on less known voices in peripheral regions of global health, vindicating health cultures have been produced by socialism across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. If you'd like to find out more, click on the link that I just placed in the chat or Google us using the name. We are also in Twitter if you prefer social media. My name is Sebastián Fonseca. I am a postdoctoral fellow in the project, mainly focusing on Latin America. And as part of the project, we want to promote conversations by engaging with researchers that already work on these topics of socialism, global health, and the Cold War. Today, we are going to be speaking on the politics of vaccination campaigns in the post-war Poland and Italy with two outstanding scholars, Dr. Marcin Stasiak and Maria Teresa Marangoni. I do apologize if the last names are not properly pronounced, but we do welcome both of you and we thank you for being here. I think, Maria Teresa, if you may be able to put your video for just 1 second so that we can see you. Maria Teresa is going to have most of her video off just because her connection is not too stable, but there we have it. Hi, Maria Teresa, thank you again. So let me introduce the speakers properly. Maria Teresa is a PhD candidate at the Department of History at the University of Exeter. She is currently focused on childhood immunization programs on the Veneto region in the northern Italy since the Second World War, unearthing the power relationships and the health discourses on the vaccination programs and how they played locally. Her work relies on archival research and interviews, mixing social history, STS approaches, and medical anthropology. And she is affiliated to our very own Wellcome Center for Cultures and Environments of Health at Exeter and a member of the Italian Oral History Society. Our second speaker is Marcin Stasiak. He is a visiting scholar at the Center for Cultures and Environments of Health. He's a historian. He completed a PhD a few years ago at the Jagellonian University. I'm so sorry, I think I mispronounced that. And he worked on the history of polio-related disability during the Cold War. Actually, he will be publishing a book on that topic coming up soon. It will be published in Polish, but we look forward to the translation. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of History in this same university in Krakow. And he is the PI of a project called Vaccination Campaigns in Poland during the 1945 and 1970, where he will be speaking at tonight. His project is founded by the National Science Center in Poland, and he is also a member of the steering committee of a newly established international research platform, Disability Studies in Eastern Europe. So very excited to know more about that. Just for everyone to know, each of our speakers will be presenting their work in roughly 20 minutes. I will be helping out with the time. And then after this, we will open the floor for discussions between our presenters and the broader audience. So without further ado, I will leave the floor now to Marcin for his work.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for this nice introduction. And I will start with what I would like to say. So just from the beginning, I'm approaching in this presentation. Oh, sorry, I need to also to show you my presentation. I think it could help.
There, the share screen, the green
Yeah,
one.
that one. Sorry, and this is. Could you please? Sorry.
Go down to the blue Zoom thing. That's it, yeah.
This one? Okay, okay, sorry. I know.
Yeah, and then up, over.
Here.
Yeah, and then where the green.
Okay, yeah, I see.
Yeah.
I see. That's one.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Ah, wonderful.
And now it's slideshow. And from the beginning. Okay. Okay, so in my today presentation, I'm approaching vaccination campaign from the lenses of political and social history. On the most general level, the question is how studying vaccination campaigns can enrich understanding of the state, society nexus in authoritarian communist regimes in Eastern Europe after the World War II. Addressing such an issue, I use the example of post-war Poland. I'm focused on the period from the late 40s till the mid-60s. It was when the state launched large-scale vaccination programs as the primary preventive tool or a measure against the most common and dangerous infectious disease of the time, so smallpox, typhoid fever, of course, tuberculosis, diphtheria, polio, pertussis. Among them, only the smallpox vaccine had been used on the mass scale before the war. The rest were something new and more or less unknown for most of the country population. And by the mid-60s, all of these vaccinations became more or less widely accepted by the general public. At the turn of the 40s and 50s, it was not so clear. And even in the mid-50s, it was not so clear, as the vaccination rates across the country rarely met the authorities' goals. I believe that following the process of making immunization a routine, medical procedure provides an opportunity to shed light on the state-society relationship in this period. Okay, what I'm presenting today it's just 20 minutes. So these are reflections from, let's say, field work, which in historian case also it usually means a file work. It's only my case, and it is a result of facing specific challenges while collecting and studying data. So somehow it's a personal story. Let's say. The source base for the presentations includes the Ministry of Health and provincial bodies of healthcare administration records. So I decided to take a close look on two regions, the Kraków regions, where I live, and Lublin province. The former is located in the southern part of the country, near the mountains, while the latter is in the eastern part of the country, just on the eastern border. And then combine these findings with interrogating selected peer review journals. Let me begin. Let me begin with a story. Okay, last December, taking advantage of the gap between two lockdowns, I was doing research in Kraków archive, and I found one very interesting document from 1955. It is a detailed report issued by the head of a BCG, so anti-tuberculosis vaccination squad. The squad visited primary school number 1 in Nowy Targ, a town located 60 kilometers south of Kraków, so just on the highlands. Just after their arrival, the squad arrival, the elder children simply escaped the school before tuberculin trials began. Then parents showed up and demanded to stop the action. They shouted, and these are exact citations, "You should make experiments on the rabbits. The vaccine caused death. We are not obliged to be vaccinated. Go to colchozes, vaccinate cows." Colchozes are state farms in USSR. The anger was escalating. The crowd injured the squad driver, and finally, medics decided to retreat with nothing. The next day, they visited a high school in the same town. The effect was similar. The arrival of the squad was obviously not accidental. In fact, it was just a tiny piece of large state-driven project of immunization of that time. This is Nowy Targ. This is this town, and okay, and the BCG vaccinations were initiated in the 1948. At the very beginning, it was a part of this campaign. So the International Tuberculosis Committee across Europe, you can see a badge. It was Danish Red Cross, and it was known. This vaccine was known as a Danish vaccine, and in fact, the strain was Danish. It was Copenhagen, 1341. And in the following years, it became the responsibility of the state's healthcare facilities with vaccinations. BCG became compulsory for children in 1955. From 1959, also adults were obliged to be vaccinated. And even earlier, the typhus and typhoid vaccines were introduced, and the typhoid vaccine was compulsory, but for limited portions of citizens beginning in the 1939. Smallpox vaccinations were obligatory for children, as I mentioned yet before the war. And the outbreak of diphtheria epidemics in the early 50s pushed the Ministry of Health to make them the 3-dose vaccine an obligation for children in 1954. From the turn of 50s and 60s, the DTP vaccine was introduced, so it was diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis combined. Finally, polio vaccinations started in 1958. None of these actions was obviously taken into public consideration. The decisions were discussed in narrow circles of ministry officials and scientists, but by no means publicly debated. That's a vaccination countryside in this period, more or less. Sending the mobile vaccination squad to that school and similar ones to many other places, on one hand, was the urgent need for epidemiological and also economic reasons. At the turn of 30s and 50s, infectious disease was definitely on the rising tide, and the experts talking about the catastrophe or disaster was not exaggerating very much. Among the most common causes of death, especially among children, were diphtheria and pertussis. While typhoid fever morbidity was declining in the 50s, Poland was still among the top European countries with the highest incidence rates of that disease. And additionally, in the 1951, the polio epidemics began. So here you can see a graphs with diphtheria, pertussis, and tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is beginning in 1952. It's just because this, the statistics before was not very reliable, but still but tuberculosis was in fact the biggest threat. According to the Ministry of Health estimations in 1964, TB was the cause of death of 120,000 people, and over 1 million lived with the disease. Morbidity and mortality gradually dropped. However, it was still high comparing to the other European countries. The death rate in 1950 was over 100 per 100,000, and so it was high. Simultaneously, the scene from the school in this middle-sized Polish town was strongly rooted in the political and ideological foundations of the communist state. From the late 40s onwards, the state was claimed itself a sole provider of the health care services. The change was similar in every single country in the Eastern Bloc. It was something normal then. So this changes meant the implementation of Soviet patterns, so the so-called Siemaszko model. It is how it is characterized by authors. I think it's in concise way. According to the model, the state was to take the responsibility for the health of its citizens, as the scene described at the beginning shows. Vaccinations was, however, at least an ambiguous legitimization measure. In the stick and carrot scheme sits somewhere between the two. What about the stick? To make vaccination effective, the system of epidemiological and sanitary administration was established in the beginning of the 50s. It was a hierarchical structure with the central governing body, State Sanitary Inspectorate, and the net of its local branches in provinces and counties. Those institutions were responsible not only to provide cards, planning and supervising vaccinations, all these doctors and nurses. On the other hand, they carried a stick, a right to control individuals, check if they took obligatory vaccination, and eventually impose fines. That is generally how authoritarian regimes work. They impose their will on the general public and do their best to limit people's freedom of choice. Yeah? If we would try to find the general notion of that type of relations, we could take a term of strategic power. So Chandra Mukherjee defines it like a will of domination. It's a quotation. Will of domination often associated with the use of threat of legitimate violence. And she adds that its quotation still works. It works because people respond to favors and threats, and by extension, surveillance, aligning their behaviors to regime. What is interesting for me, the notion of strategic power appeared to be insufficient when explaining the process of making vaccination an accepted routine procedure. Firstly, the state representatives rarely used or force or strong pressure. So in this regard, the situation in Novotark is somehow typical. The head of the squad tried persuasion and organized a lecture about vaccines on the spot. But eventually, of course, he and his colleagues retreated. As I learned from the local reports, at least till the end of the 50s, the bodies responsible for using these coercive measures were not especially eager to impose fines on people ignoring vaccinations. Of course, it varied regionally, it's important, but in general, their representatives needed to be pushed by local authorities to undertake central disciplinary actions. Of course, to some extent, it seemed to be quite a reasonable behavior. It happened that even the prospect of fines did not discourage and so-called anti-vaxxers. In 1953, there's a quotation from archive you see here. The head of the local health administration in Lublin admitted that, as you can see, this quotation, not everybody has understood the importance of vaccinations. For instance, tractor drivers from Machnov, which was a state farm, refused to be vaccinated against typhoid fever, that stated that they would prefer to pay the fine. Machnov was a state farm, a Russian kolkhoz. Yeah. To sum up, all of this is also visible in the statistical data, especially in the case of BCG vaccination of newborns. The new legal regulations did not affect the piece of vaccination, nor did establish administrative bodies, such as sanitary inspectorate and its branches. My point here is that the repressive power of communist regime was not a decisive factor in reaching high vaccination rates. So it is not my intention here, to be clear, to completely neglect the coercive measures. They play a certain role, for sure, but as I believe, they did not act as a game changer. The actual background of the final success of the programs, turning them into routine medical procedures, will be easier, I believe, will be easier to understand when we combine the two previous cases, these quotations, with a piece of radio broadcast from the 1960s. The countryside physician described his early years in a primary healthcare facility in 1957. And yeah, this quotation, he thought, I started to call mothers. It took a year. I called them, they didn't appear. If they eventually came up, they started to fight, saying, what do you want from me? The kid is well and healthy. I do not need a doctor. Things began to go better when polio vaccines started. Because it was a vaccine imported from the United States, I started to spread a rumor among neighbors that it cost $5 and it would be a pity to waste such an amount of money. All of a sudden, all mothers came up, and afterwards, they appeared regularly, both for periodic examination of children and other vaccinations. This fragment is interesting because of polio vaccine and its overseas origin as a proof of quality, and it should be it could be also discussed in this way. But what I would like to discuss in this case, is on more general level, man. And I would like to compare it with the first story. So the young doctor succeeded because he made medical procedures, not vaccination alone, a part of daily life. He managed to build confidence, move himself and his facility from the margins to the center of the local community. That was a crucial transformation. In the years following World War II, for the most Polish population, I mean peasants, visiting healthcare facilities were not included in the set of daily life habits. So in many cases, they decided to ask for doctor's help in the most severe conditions. The hospital was for them, and in their viewpoints, it existed rather as a place of dying than caring. It was caused mainly by the fact that many settlements were visually, cut off from healthcare facilities. Firstly, a big portion of peasants were, okay, yeah, that's it. So healthcare, they were cut off of healthcare facilities. Firstly, they were uninsured till early 70s, and that means that only selected healthcare services were covered by the state. And secondly, it was physically hard to get in touch with medical staff. The records of health administration in the 50s are full of complaints about the low accessibility of healthcare facilities and doctors, nurses, and so on. It was nothing uncommon to travel 10 or 15 kilometers to the nearest doctor or nurse, especially in the eastern part of the country. Then it is not surprise that peasants used services of local quirks, members of the same community, well established in local networks. So therefore, establishing a new medical-oriented networks was the condition of transforming vaccination into a habit or into regular practice. In the first step, it was a matter of matter, let's say, of changing the environment, building state and professional medicine into the countryside. And then, as in the example, make this infrastructure work. It is mundane infrastructural work, of course, involving first materiality, from needles and statistical sheets to ambulances and buildings, and repeatable actions. Secondly, what I'm talking about is evident in this before mentioned BCG vaccinations of newborns. The rates rose because, firstly, the net of obstetric wards had risen, and mothers began to use them normally as a better solution than home birth. Thirdly, the logistics of vaccination improved. That means that wards got a staff, a needle, and a syringe before the mother and the child left facility. That was a process, significant process. The mothers, who left the facility or the hospital before the vaccination came, because it took a week and it was too much for them, because they need to go to work. These observations from field work, let's say, inspired me to rethink or enrich my understanding of communist authoritarian regime rule as applied to the healthcare facilities or services, at least, or more precisely, a conceptual frame of reference for studying post-war communist regimes. They strictly correspond with the second type of power proposed by Mukherjee, so logistic power. As she noted, logistical activity shapes social life differently, affecting the environment, context, situation, location in which human action and cognition take place. So it is, as Patrick Carroll adds, the quotation, so the state is realized not by a power that is located in the center and spreads out in concentric circles, but is in multiple locales in which socio-corporeity and socio-materiality are invested, and through the networking of all of this by a government which claims a unitarian, univocal voice over life. Of course, that is still the same state. Logistical power is linked to the strategic one. I'm not going to discuss the issue in the full extent. My point here is that the concept is exceptionally useful in approaching state-society nexus in post-war authoritarian regimes, or Poland at least. Historians tend to observe the post-war communist state exclusively as a realm of strategic power. Such a state looks like a solid, one-piece, monolithic structure. The relations are predominantly put into a vertical or hierarchical order. Using the concept of logistic state or logistic power can help to understand the communist state not only as a big ideological or political project, but simultaneously as an assemblage of tiny, boring, mundane activities and materiality entangled with them. I'm not sure if it means deeper understanding, but at least a bit different. And at least it, pushed me to take a look on a bit different places and a bit different objects and information simply in archival sources. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcin, for your presentation. Next up, we have Maria Teresa. She did request for her video not to be on. If it is possible to have it on, that'd be great. But I know that maybe connection might not. Yeah, if connection fails, it's fine. Yeah. We're still here paying attention. So yes, we'll hand it over to you. Clear.
Okay, I'll try to share my video, my screen. If it takes too long to load, then unfortunately I will have to do without the slides.
That's all right. Is it possible to maybe have your slides, but not your video, in case that may be able to help out with the
Hopefully it will
connection?
work. Otherwise, I will just have to talk without the slides. Not working, is it?
No, it's taking a bit of time to load. There we go. We can see the slides now.
I'm not sure what's happening on my side. Everything seems to be frozen.
Right.
No. It's not working, is it?
No, I'm afraid
Well, I
not.
try to.
Is that working better for you? Okay, you seem to be moving the screen properly, but we can't hear you, Maria Teresa.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see it, and we can hear you.
As a full screen or as a, PowerPoint?
No, yeah, just a PowerPoint presentation, not full screen.
Okay, I'll try one more time. If not, I will just have to do without and see what happens.
Okay, fingers crossed, they look great.
Okay, so in the meantime, whilst we are waiting for the slides to load, if they will load, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, I think Maria Teresa may be having problems with the internet.
Yeah, it seems so. Oh gosh.
Goodness. Let me try to text her on the chat to let her know that we can't.
If she emails the PowerPoint presentation to me, can I share it from my laptop here? I don't know. I'm just
I'm gonna
trying to, and she says, next slide.
She did mention that her internet was not stable. Okay, so maybe while we get Maria Teresa back, I was wondering, and I'm just going to take the floor here, taking advantage of being the moderator in the presentation, and maybe address just one particular question that arose from Marcin's presentation, and it was, I'm very curious, Marcin, to know more about this idea of logistical power, and well, your broad conclusion was very much around it. And I felt I wanted to know a bit more about the link that this idea had with the development of the vaccination program, meaning was logistical power part of the state apparatus during the communist regime in Poland? Or did I understand correctly that actually it seems to be like a system, a state of affairs that happened parallel to a repressive structure that was in place by communism? What was the relationship between the two? And if you wanted to please expand a bit more on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, it's still a question, which, but I'm studying as it is a bit complex. But and of course, what I said is limited, because the problem is wider. And this is also this is just selection. It is also about not that that end in the, let's say, a healthcare facility, but it is also a question of another end, like the scientist community. That's and also as, let's say, a state productive capacities. That's a question. So of course it is entangled, it is mixing with each other. But what I was trying to get is just to see the same things from the from the different angle. So just take just take a look on this needle. There's also a fantastic piece in Dora book about the leaking needles, which is fantastic for me. It's like it's also catchy. And when I was, it is also a matter of the types of archival sources, of course. That's a kind of methodological thing. When I got to this minute, detailed descriptions of people doing vaccinations or responding to vaccinations, I can see these networks, but it's still, of course, the same country, the same state, and it is linked with each other. I don't forget that this is an authoritarian state, which is shooting to people from time to time. I think Maria is not.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. So we have Maria back. I presume the internet was not working very well, but if you could, Maria, just maybe your presentation. I presume the slides will not be possible, so we're happy to hear you and just pay extra attention and being very careful about your thoughts. So yeah, take it on.
Okay, so shall I try again with the slides, or shall I just leave them be? And so obviously it's not working. I don't know.
Yeah, just
leave them be. Okay.
Yeah, just
shame, because I had some nice photos.
Yeah. Maybe at the end we might be able to try again. Just for the sake of time, I think we're just going to move into your talk.
So just give me a sec. Right. Okay. So first of all, hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So my talk is going to be about specifically one interview that I conducted a couple of years ago, just before COVID set in. So I was supposed to be conducting a lot more interviews. However, I was stopped by the situation. But this gave me the opportunity to take into considerations a few thoughts that I had the previous years about how to use interviews, specifically with regards to the wider context of health research and global health research. So my talk today is about this specific interview, and it's titled "An Elderly Gentleman in Vicenza," who is my interviewee of that time. And I will briefly introduce you to the context of my research, and then I will move on to introducing you to Vicenza, where it is and where it was at during the time of the narrated events in the course of the interview. And I will introduce you to Marcello and the interview and what is, the many very interesting things that he says during the interviews. And then I will briefly talk about oral health with with regards to the context of health research and give you my conclusions. Right, so at this point I would have presented Vicenza, but let me just talk briefly about my research. So I'm exploring the intersections between global health and local health governance. I became interested in this topic a few years back. I was then doing a course in medical anthropology, so I was particularly interested in all issues about how people themselves perceive health and the environment of health and the environment of medicine, and specifically from a cultural point of view. And suddenly I was in Italy, as I am now, and I saw appearing in the newspapers and in the news news about measles and measles outbreaks and measles here and measles there. And I was surprised because nobody really used to talk about measles, because measles, as far as I was concerned, but you know, and this was part of my research question. My research question was my perception representative of the wider cultural environment, or was it just me? So, I mean, I thought I was, but so I'm doing my interviews, my research, and I will arrive at the answer with regards to this as well. So I did ask myself this question. I asked around, and you know, to my peers and also to people that are older than me, parents and grandparents, and because I was surprised. And it soon came out that the government was preparing a law with regards to vaccine mandates for this specific childhood disease, which had been, as I was saying, so far regarded as just one of the many different childhood diseases that kids go through without much concern. So I started exploring this theme, and I started preparing a research proposal, which I wanted to develop as a PhD, and here I am. This is roughly the background of my research project. So this interview I conducted in the 2nd of March in 2020. And here in Vicenza. I was introduced to this gentleman by an acquaintance of mine, his daughter, and we conducted the interview at her home, surrounded by his grandchildren, so it was a bit noisy, but it was overall a very friendly and warm environment. He is Marcello Farneda. That's his name and surname. At the time of the interview, he was 75 years old, and he's a very kindly gentleman, not very tall, medium build. He has a warm, deep voice and speaks very calmly. He was eager to participate in this project, and so the conversation was very easy and very easy flowing. Just to give you a background to the interview itself, which in oral history is always quite important. So I will give you the context of Vicenza. Vicenza is a town/city. It has about 114,000 inhabitants. It's in the north and east part of Italy, between Verona and Venice. Just to give you an idea of where it is, in between two quite famous cities in Italy. It is a very wealthy city or town. I'm always never sure whether to call it a town or a city, because we would call it a city here in Italy with regards to inhabitants number, but okay, so I will say city from now on. So it is very wealthy. It has been wealthy ever since its inception. In fact, Venice itself was born out of the will of inhabitants from Vicenza and surrounding areas, wealthy inhabitants, to flee from barbarian invasions. So it has been a wealthy city for thousands of years. So I would show you the pictures. The wealth of the city is shown everywhere. It has beautiful buildings, beautiful churches, a fantastic central square, which is called Piazza dei Signori, with a big Palladio Basilica. The architect Palladio is one of the famous architects in history of art. And it is surrounded by rural areas all around. So there was a striking difference between the inhabitants of the city itself and the inhabitants of the immediate surroundings and the suburban areas, which were mostly peasants. Marcello was the son of traders. So he calls himself somebody who belongs to an in-between social class. He talks about this in great detail in his interview, because he from the very beginning of the interview paints a picture of the difference between where he comes from and the people that he met during elementary school and in his middle school years, in relation to my initial question, which was, have you had the measles when you were a child? Just give me 1 second, please. Okay. So I actually, in my slides, had a few bits of the excerpts of the interview that I wanted to show you. So I will read them because it is actually it makes it salient to the whole question of the interview and the method of a history of life, the story of life with regards to health research. So I will read you a few bits of the interview. So my first question was, have you had measles as a child? And he says, I don't know what kind of diseases, for sure scarlet fever, for sure I got those infectious diseases typical of children. And whooping cough, I got it when I was 20 years old. I was vaccinated against smallpox. Here, it indicates the deltoid muscle. Against tetanus, I think. I was born and the war ended after a month, the Second World War. So at the time, the vaccinations were against polio for sure, but it was all quite in the sense of improvised and approximate. Very, very fragile, the situation of those years. I had many childhood friends with polio, children who took TBC, that's what he said literally, meaning tuberculosis, companions, because vaccines were still, well, they weren't compulsory. Hospitals had been bombed. It was a time when healthcare was recovering from the disaster that had been the war. So he's already giving me, with my first question, a picture of the social conditions that he lived in, starting from 1951, when he started his elementary school years. And here I had a picture of Vicenza as it was during the time that he was talking about here. So I asked him later on, how were diseases managed in that case? And he answers, I remember that there was the general practitioner, and then the disease was seen as those things pretty much, what can you say, predictable childhood diseases. It was seen as something like a game. It wasn't perceived in the family as a danger. Here I am, my impression is that scarlet fever and those others, etc., they all get it, then it goes, it is a growing up disease. To me personally, it has never been transmitted as a danger. You have to get the vaccine. This can happen to you with a lot of fatalism. Everyone gets them, children's diseases, and those things were seen as very light. the perception I had was that they were seen as very, so to say, easy. And he said that in English, actually, he said easy. So as you can see here, he's given me precisely the answer to my initial question, which was, what was the perception of this disease? Was it perceived as a danger, as was currently being described at the time of the interview by the media and by the government as a preparation for the vaccine mandate? Which, okay, I failed to say earlier, sorry, that vaccinations against the measles were only recommended at that time. There wasn't a mandate in Italy. Okay, and so I was curious, obviously, to see whether it was a widespread approach, this idea that it wasn't such a danger. And he said, quite widespread in our social class where we lived mostly. The social class above mine, I don't know. There was a very wide class below us in terms of number of people. I, fortunately, was in a family that were traders. My mom had a fruit and vegetable store, her brothers of appliances, the first department store, and so on. So that we were in an intermediate range, unquestionably decent for the end of the war. There were in class with me at school, we were about 30, there were people who, poor people, kids who did not even have proper clothes to wear, who did not have, so here I brought the sandwich, but they, and I divided it because in short, yes, somewhat dramatic situations, guys whose dad had died in the war, things like that. So he continues with the picture, and I'm starting to get a very detailed picture of a lot of poverty, despite there being people like him that weren't faring particularly bad. They had food, and they had jobs, and a lot of other people in the vicinity and in the surrounding area of Vicenza, as I was saying before, which was rural, there was where the majority of people came from, and also kids who came to school who were very, very poor. So I was also curious about issues of public health, whether it was discussed at all, whether there was talk about how to manage diseases properly, medically speaking. And he answered, no, no, no. Just a part, let's just say, began to be felt, I think, when I was doing middle school. Then they began a little bit to say, do brush your teeth. I recommend this. I recommend. At the end of elementary school, there were teachers who wanted me to show them my nails. That was the beginning of attention to hygiene a little, no? At the time, all kids were without teeth, because there was no nutrition, especially it was poor of everything, even if we never suffered from hunger, but of course, but no, attention to hygiene, I began to understand it, the diseases, when I was around 13 to 14, that age there. So we are moving now from the period immediate after the war and into the 1950s and 60s. So he wanted to describe those kids with which he used to share the sandwiches at school with in more detail. And this is what he told me about them. Especially the first suburbs were of peasants who had had everything taken away, destroyed, bombed. For that social group, the situation was heavy. It was heavy because we citizens of the city went to kindergarten or to preschool, and there, for better or worse, there was a little attention. You were looked at. If you had a sore throat, they told the carers, the boy, the little girl has the. So attending these places, there was a little attention. They saw if a child had a cold. While those who were outside, who could not, the children were in the courtyards, in the courts, in the stables outside, and there was disaster. Disaster because there was no healthcare. It was more for animals. There was a veterinarian who went out, wasn't there? Because animals were the source of livelihood. The child, many were born in the family, you know, in all families, 7, 8, 10. So the picture becomes ever more clearer. for the people outside of the city center, people who don't belong to the working classes, the urban working classes, it was more important to preserve the health of the animals than that of the child. So I was also curious to know what his family made of the recommendations, public health recommendations. And he said, yes, for my years, unfortunately, there were other priorities. However, in the sense that everything was precarious, I fractured 2 wrists and there was no orthopedics in Vicenza. There was only the surgery department, and they plastered my arms in surgery, not in orthopedics. Orthopedics was established here, I think, in 64 in Vicenza, 1964. Before there was not. You broke a leg and you put it in place, and the guy who put it in place was the guy who operated appendicitis. So it worked. That doctor who did appendicitis, hernia, or tonsils also plastered your arm. And again, so the description of the public health situation in Vicenza at that time is one of extreme precariousness. The hospitals were bombed. The priorities were others than thinking about childhood diseases. And the other thing that stands out is that those diseases weren't regarded as something to be afraid of, but rather something that happened and that you would have to pass in order to grow up. And so my question was, well, did they know that some of these diseases can be fatal? And what he says with regards to this particular question is, we all lived a bit in my opinion, in a star that we always hoped would shine, in the sense, it will never happen to me, but no, it happened to him. Oh, poor guy, huh? But and instead there was the widespread pulmonary TBC, tuberculosis, which was very widespread in those years, yes. And he goes on to talk about this thing. So again, he's talking about pulmonary tuberculosis and the sanatoriums and soldiers who came back from the war with devastated lungs, and who nevertheless still smoked like chains. And they smoked garbage because cigarettes weren't the highest quality. And the other disease that people became increasingly scared by was poliomyelitis. So again, measles didn't really figure that much in the horizon of things to be afraid of or to be worried about. And he says, then the diseases, those of the children, the rubella, those things there, yes, they were there, but they did not vaccinate, in the sense that they suffered this disease, they passed, and then later it was gone. So yeah, he doesn't, even here, he doesn't mention measles. And since we were talking about triangulating sources, I could not find in those years a specific measles scare anywhere, not in Vicenza, not in Veneto, and not in Italy either. So this doesn't surprise me that he doesn't even mention measles, but he mentions rubella, which in fact was a little bit more of a concern because of girls, and taking it. It was more well known that getting rubella as a girl after having grown up already, so not as a child, would perhaps give you problems when pregnant and in pregnancy. Okay, so
you have 1 minute. Sorry, Maria.
Yeah, it's okay. Obviously, so I hope I managed to give you roughly. That was only about 1/3 of the interview, and already he had given me a wealth of information of elements that I would then be able to go and find sources to triangulate with. And what I perceived was that starting from an interview rather than starting from archival sources, especially when you're talking about a topic that's not particularly well researched, such as the perception of diseases, especially those diseases that are common. Here I said, if it's interview-led and you can triangulate sources, because the interviewer can give you such a wealth of information for you to then go on and research in the archives, that perhaps if you did it the other way around, it wouldn't really be possible, or it wouldn't give you as many ideas of where to look. And I don't have much time to go into health and oral history research, but that's okay. I was just hoping to make it clear that if you're starting from the interview, such as a history of life sort of interview, instead of really focusing on the specific theme that you're interested in, will give you, the interviewer, such a space in elaborating his story that will give you as a researcher so many elements to then try and triangulate through the archival sources. And okay, this is about it from me. I had quite a few more things, however, linked to the photographs. So because I haven't been able to show you, I'm afraid that this will have to do for today. Hopefully in the future, I will be able to offer a better idea of this whole theme. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria Teresa, for this great presentation. We are going to open the floor for other people that might have questions, and we can begin our discussion. And just as a way to let people prepare their questions, by the way, you can write it in the chat. I can read it out loud, or preferably, if you would like to turn on your video and your microphone to ask the question directly, that would also be great. But just to get us started, I actually wanted to address something that you touched upon, Maria Teresa, at the end, but obviously for both of you to maybe give your thoughts on it, is this tension in the methods that are being used. Maria Teresa clearly did, or is currently still doing an oral history and making different interviews and trying to catch something about the social history of immunology and immunization programs in Italy. But then we see also that Marcin was mostly focused on archives, and he even has data that he showed in graphs. And there is always a tension between the two when creating the narratives, when putting together the data that is guided towards history. Now, in my own work, one of the things that we've spoken about within our group is how to deal with the question of the validity in oral history. It seems that in publications and in research related with the history of science, there is a very strong tension with whether oral history is a legit form of data collection. I've spoken with other historians that have been at Exeter as well, and it's not just an issue of the history of science. It seems that other fields of historical research also have that tension. And I wanted to know your thoughts about it, Maria Teresa. For instance, you, now that you're doing this, I know that you are also mixing a lot of STS and medical anthropology, and you're doing this very interesting interdisciplinary work. How do you view that tension? And Marcin, if you had an experience with that, or maybe just from your viewpoint of researching archives, and what sense you make out of this?
Yes, actually, I'm very aware that there is this tension, and oral historians are still somewhat trying to gain the legitimacy that other historians are not particularly willing to grant. However, it seems that it is gaining traction because, especially in more recent works, where in all sorts of fields, where oral historians are in effect triangulating the sources, I think this is probably the key element. You are doing oral history, but you're also triangulating. So it really depends on the work that you want to do, because you can still do pure oral history. And in that sense, your result, what you are presenting, is a work in the sense of Alessandro Portelli's meaning, which is what you are presenting is something that is being narrated and is being interpreted by the interviewee, by the witness, and that also has, its specific legitimacy. If you want to present a work that is more grounded on so-called facts, or more traditional sources, then you need to triangulate. And oral history in that sense is not only complementary, but it's on the same level as archival sources. So yeah, it really depends on what kind of result you want to present.
Yes, Marcin.
Actually, no, I believe I can add something to that. Maybe it is not rooted in this project actually, but in my two former projects. One is PhD. And of course, what we are talking about is a very old problem, dated back 60s or at least 70s. And also Paul Thompson's critiques, it's an issue also of that. And then you have what Marisa talked about, this reaction of especially Italian oral historians, but then American and so on. But so of course it's an old story. But still, this is a question, basically, a question of time in historical research, to put it frankly and in very general terms. But in fact, that is a problem, and that was also a problem of Thompson's book. Yeah, as far as I know, he had some problems just with grasping a social change. That's why Portelli or Pastorini books or works are they go to, of course, they went to the different directions. But going back to the triangulation, which in fact I tried to do in my PhD, and I tried to use because I was tired, in fact, in using oral history just as a narrative. I was grown up with oral history like that, so I tried to do something different, and I started with that's you are Marisa doing also, yeah. Started with interviews, but I treated them, okay, let's treat them like a normal, like archive maybe, yeah. Okay, make a try, and that was interesting because they crossed, but only sometimes at some point. So I wasted a lot of hours of my research. Of course, and these interviews, but that was moments of triumph when I validate them with medical journals, for example, because I was trying to see these little moments of doing it with the screws and and after operation, and there are tiny pieces, but still they are meeting with each other. It was not a narrative, of course. But at least it were data pieces. So I like these moments very much, and I think triangulation in this regard is applicable, but it's very limited. Yeah, and the problems you have, and we are talking about these problems with historians, and and validate a historical oral history as a source. It's here because to use it in the full extent, it's better to use it like a narrative one, because you can use just the 1 hour, not the 30 seconds.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for that insight. Okay, well, I am going to pass the mic to Edna, and then Dora will also speak after. Thank you.
Hi, thank you both for these wonderful talks and learning about Poland and Italy. And I felt very familiar with Maria Teresa's description, because I think in my childhood, also in Mexico, I mean, measles and many other diseases were not considered, as dangerous as we all know they can be. And anyway, but it's part of all these personal experiences. But I wanted to ask a question, especially for Marcin, about Poland. And it's more general about authoritarian regimes. And you say that there is this kind of logistical power. And I would like to know more about the kind of middle range kind of institutions or what are the tools that the authoritarian state uses, and in which sense they are different from which are used in other settings which are not as clearly or openly authoritarian? And I'm thinking about, this connection between the on-the-ground experiences of people, these doctors being very very pragmatical and very clever in sending these rumors, for instance, so they could catch the mothers to bring the children to the clinic. But which is the kind of trust and institutions, the trust that is put into middle range kind of institutions or local clinics or state maybe the doctor that is heading the state health minister, not the federal, but the provincial doctors are known by the people, previously. And so what are these? How do you connect, these two rather different levels?
Yeah, I think. Thank you very much for that question, and I think it's very, very good insight. It's because you got a missing link, in fact, in my speech also. That's important. Of course, I should make some. Also need to, of course, to shorten it a bit. I stressed this because I think these two ends were most important as the communication became a problem. Of course, that's a problem not only in this, in this countryside settlements. It was also a problem. Communicate, between a town, because there's still I believe it's a big discrepancy in Poland between these big cities and this discrepancy and countryside. And what I mean countryside, it's not just villages or this distant settlements. There are also the small towns. Like it is also because they were weakened, or just they lose their position also in the demographic sense, as sometimes half of the population was just killed in Holocaust. So that's also the problem of just in the years after the war. And but of course there is of course, there were links, and if I was studying these materials, there are reports, and these people are gathering. So ministry officials are coming to the provincial cities, these provincial capitals, so relatively big centers, and they are interrogating these people from this administration, and then the same thing was done by these officials, but in the county level. Yeah, so there were connections, and minister was pushing the guy. I think maybe it's quite normal in every single city, in every single country. Yeah, what the difference was, I believe, and maybe it's a reason also for not pushing these people so much. But I don't feel, maybe it's my fault, but I didn't find a police involved in that, because that was a institution who had an authority, in fact, because they are really using a force, just a force. And then when this guy from the let's say sanitarian administration came, it is no one to be scared about, yeah, because he was just a guy from administration, yeah, and it was a man probably operating on the local level. Yeah, but I don't know if I'm clear, and I respond to your question. But of course, still, that is of course very important question of a stage of a levels of authority or just pressure.
Great. Maria Teresa, you wanted to say something on that question, or was it another question that you had? You wanted to say something on the question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, actually it links with Edna's question, because I think it was pretty much clear that the background for my research is all cultural. So I'm looking at cultural elements. So in Marcin, my question was, how were the doctors regarded as? Were they trusted, or were they viewed as particularly important persons, or were they seen as somebody with a saintly aura around them, as is sometimes the case here in Italy? So I was wondering whether there is a parallel with that. Thank you.
Of course, it varied. Really, it varied. It's also there are also, I think, differences between still this is the same thing with in cities and at countryside, but the situation is also complicated, but because you have not only doctors, but okay, I don't remember the name in English. Sorry, it is a man who is half a doctor. It's not it's like after a two years course. Yeah. So this, and also, but regarding to the doctors, if the doctor was just gain the trust, I don't know, build bathrooms, or I don't know. Yeah, paramedic. Thank you very much. Yeah, but this is so. Yeah, that's it. And if it built a trust, but I know some cases of such doctors. They became local local stars, compared to the priest. Yeah, that's the teacher, priest, and doctor. Yeah, that's a triangle. So yeah, and I think the number of these people were growing. You know, that's also a kind of fame because they decided to come to this place. It was not easy decision to go to the countryside in Poland in the 50s. Oh, in fact, it's still not easy decision. But then there was even worse. So yes, if they operate for some time, that means that they are accepted.
Wonderful. Dora.
Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry that I missed Marcin's presentation. I hope to go back and watch it on the recording. Apologies for that. But just on that point of when I love how you compared some of these doctors to the role of the preacher and the priest. I mean, the priest. I'm wondering. So it's a quick question to you, Marcin. I'm wondering if we know if these doctors were, you know, a lot of these doctors, especially in the 50s, had been doctors before the war as well. And at least in the case of Hungary, they're quite on the conservative side, a lot of them, especially because so many of the Jewish doctors were killed, right? Or the remaining left. So there's a weird kind of social thing going on with the doctors, and I was wondering how you see the politics of that fitting in, or if it's irrelevant, or if it's relevant to this vaccination project. And then Teresa, I found it fascinating that what you described through this elderly gentleman's case is this relationship to disease, right? And we see this often as a critique against vertical interventions into, you know, certain African contexts, especially that, you know, that this is not our biggest problem right now, right? We're happy that we survived the war. There's, you know, not enough food, the hospitals are bombed, you know, there's so many other health issues. That TB is an enormous problem. So there's like, on the scale of, you know, these things, measles and some other diseases are, well, you know, they're there, but this is not what we actively care about. There are also a lot of critiques, for instance, with the polio eradication program, that, well, actually children are dying from, you know, contaminated water. There's no access to clean water. Why are we spending money on this, right? This is not our biggest concern. So I was wondering if where you see that going, or what is the feeling you have, and how also in terms of research, you know, now that you have, you know, some of these oral history interviews, how are you going to go about to kind of tackle this and follow up, what kind of strands you're going to follow up with archives and published materials and, you know, other types of sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora, for the question. Okay.
Can we let Marcin first and then?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
The question about doctors. The problem in Poland with doctors and these attitudes is when, is that, you know, and it is a general problem in 50s and 40s, and of course in the 50s also. No, they were in fact decimated during the war. So this is a large drop. So this of course, many survived the war, but if they survived, I believe, most of them just settled in the towns or in the cities. So it was I remember a broadcast also from radio. Of course, it's just one example, but there was a interview with a doctor who was, you know, settled in the countryside, and he, of course, talking about what is a very hard terrain and so on and so on. But he raised but it was not very hard for him, because he had raised in the countryside, he's a son of a peasant. Yeah, so that was a path, I believe, a common path after the war. Yeah, but still, that was it's a huge problem, because they wanted to settle in the cities. So I think half of discussions in the Ministry of Health was about people, about the doctors and nurses who didn't want to work in the countryside in these facilities.
Maria.
Okay, sorry about it before. Okay, so where am I taking it? This is in fact one of the main discussion points that I will develop in my research, which is what place do these childhood diseases actually hold, within a person's life? And this is particularly the element that I will need to find out with my interviews, because that's, I will be talking to people about this, in order to be able to see where these diseases fit in the narrative of their own lives. However, this will be then set in comparison with archival sources, which are the medical encyclopedia of the time, in the decades from roughly after the 50s up to 2017, with the discourse of the media and the government that came out during that time of, the preparation to the vaccine mandates against the measles. And with the WHO, the World Health Organization, again, discourse on these kinds of diseases and the place they supposedly hold in people's lives in the priorities. Because that's all very interesting, because we have the discourse on the one hand, which is the one that is bestowed upon, the people, and then we have people's lives, basically. And what their priorities are. So this is how I'm going to triangulate the sources.
Great, wonderful. Well, it is 5 p.m. I think we can wrap up our meeting. Thank you so much, Maria Teresa and Marcin, for the presentation today, and everyone else that attended. I'm sure we have many more other things to talk about, but do stay tuned. Again, if you are more curious about our project, you can find us in Connecting Three Worlds on Google. So with that, I will bid everyone goodbye, and